So we left off last week. We were talking about different methods. Okay, and this is the wash methods of our different liquid penetrants. And post-emulsifiable, I kind of had a rush at the end. I didn't want to end before it, but at the same time, I didn't get to discuss it to the level I want to. But I did mention at the end that post-emulsifiable means, let me start actually a little back. So remember the penetrant methods, there's A, B, and C. A is water wash. This has an emulsifier built into the dye. So it's an oil-based dye, but it has an emulsifier which allows water to weakly bond to the dye in order to be able to wash excess off. Okay. Solvent removable doesn't necessarily, it may or may not have an emulsifier in it. Typically, if it's only solvent removable, it's not going to have an emulsifier, but that's because we're going to use a solvent with it that can dissolve or kind of break up the dye a little bit. Now, the one you're going to use in lab, the ZL60D, we have in liquid form and we have in aerosol form. But it's the same dye that you'll use for liquid form on the bench, aerosol form for portable, and that does have an emulsifier in it even when it's the solvent removable. You know, in the cans, it's technically solvent removable. You use a solvent cleaner, but you could use water to remove it as well. It still has that emulsifier in it. So that's a dual method penetrant, but for our purposes, the liquid that's on the bench is method A, water washable, and the aerosol based that you're going to use in the portable system is method C, solvent removable. Methods B and D were those post-emulsifiable. That means the emulsifier is not included in the dye from the get-go. And so you have to apply it after you've put the dye on and allowed it to dwell for that period of time. You have to apply the emulsifier prior to the rinsing step. And these are used as it allows that water wash to remove the excess penetrant. And it also does form a bit of a breakdown process. It can even have a bit of a solvent action as well. The difference between B and D, B, lipophilic, means oil. Lipophilic means it's attracted to oil. Okay, so it's more attracted to oil than it is to water. So it's going to bond more tightly to the dye, and it's going to cause more of that breakdown of the dye itself. Method D, hydrophilic, bonds more closely with the water. It's more tightly bonded to the water, but it still creates a weak bond with the oil that's in the penetrant to allow that water to wash it away. Method B was created first. Lipophilic came first, and it's more sensitive to process, and it's much harder to do correctly, to the point where as little as 15 seconds of wash time can be the difference between a properly done procedure and a not properly done procedure. If you leave that on too long, it will actually overwash and it'll pull that dye back out of any cracks or discontinuities where that capillary action has pulled it into place. Method D is more forgiving. Typically, it's closer to a minute. You have about a minute leeway versus a 15-second leeway when you're doing your application. And so because of that, and because, again, method D hydrophilic was developed later, method D has pretty much replaced method B for those processes where they use a post-emulsifiable method. The reason these exist is they're more sensitive. This is where you get your level 3 and your level 4 dyes versus the level 1, half 1, and 2, which we'll be working with. So your solvent removable, method C, and your water washable, method A, are typically limited to level 2 or below. Whereas the post-emulsifiables, you can get levels 3 and 4. You can find those finer cracks, discontinuities, and damage. But the process is significantly more process dependent that you do it correctly. Who remembers the types? I talked about methods just now. Who remembers types? How many types are there? 2. People are holding up 2 fingers. What are the 2 types? How are they labeled? So this is A, B, C, D for methods. How are the types labeled? Type 1 and type 2. What is type 1? That's a fluorescent dye. What is type 2? It's a visible dye, typically red in color, but they do make other colors. You don't see them very often. But that's a visible dye. That's a dye you would look at under normal visible light, white light. Okay, whereas the type 1 fluorescent you would view under what? What would you use to view type 1? You would use a black light. What frequency of black light is ideal? What's that? Close. 360 is close. It's 365 angstroms. Right? Okay. So the next step after we have rinsed, after we've removed the excess penetrant, now we need to bring those flaw indications to the surface where we can see them. And we do that using a developer. And so the biggest thing is it's going to draw the penetrant out of the flaw, and that is known as blotting action or wicking. Okay, so we use capillary action. The dye uses capillary action to get pulled into those cracks. We use a blotting action to pull it back out again. And it comes out of the crack into the developer, which is at the surface now, and allows us to see where that dye got trapped, which allows us to see where there might be a crack or corrosion or other kind of discontinuity. So the other thing these can do is the developers, in some cases, typically as it blots it out, it's actually going to widen it a little bit or make it more visible, right? Because we're trying to find cracks that are too narrow to see with the naked eye. So if we pulled that dye out and it stayed that narrow, we would have a very hard time seeing it. So it pulls that dye out to the surface and kind of helps spread it just a little bit so that it makes that larger. It kind of enlarges the view of the crack so we can see it with the naked eye. So that's where that spreading out comes into play. In some of them, some developers, it creates a background to help view the penetrant. The dry powder developer that we have on the test bench does not do this. It's a clear chemical that it leaves on the surface. The aerosol-based developer we're using for portable, that leaves a white background. That leaves that white chalky material on the surface. And so that does create that contrast background. It's that very clean white background to be able to see either the fluorescent type 1 dye against or the red type 2 dye again. So not all forms of developer, and we'll talk about forms, they're known as different forms. Not all forms of developer create that background, but some of them do. And where they do, it helps to increase contrast. And the typically development time is typically around 10 minutes minimum. And again, it goes that 10 to 20 minutes for what we're doing is often sufficient. There are certain forms or methods or process techniques where it may be longer than that. In some cases, it can be upwards of an hour. The nice thing about developer oftentimes is when you apply it, it begins that blotting action right away. And it will start to pull the dye out. And if you're kind of unsure, you can let it sit a little bit longer. And it's going to hopefully pull more dye out. If you're still unsure, you can let it sit a little bit longer. You don't have to keep reapplying it or anything like that. You can look at it at 10 minutes. You can look at it again at 15 minutes. You can look at it again at 20 minutes, see if something has changed, if you're getting a little bit stronger indication to the point where, yeah, eventually it'll pull all the dye out it's going to pull out. But, you know, it can be, it's not as sensitive time-wise as the dwell period for the dye itself is, or for the washing where you can over or under wash. Basically, you apply the developer as long as you don't apply it too thick. It's pretty much going to do its job, and you can kind of look at it over time. Developers come in 6 forms: A, B, C, D, E, and F. And we'll look at each of these here moving forward. So form A is known as a dry powder developer. And this is used with typically with type 1 methods, type 1 dyes. It's the least user-friendly because it's oftentimes hard to completely and evenly dust the part. The biggest reason for that is it doesn't leave a residue behind. or it doesn't leave a visible residue behind. It doesn't have that contrasting background. And so you got to make sure you get it across the whole part. And the only way you can kind of do that is remember where you've actually applied it. You can't actually see where the developer gets left behind. And so what happens is the developer itself, it's little little particles of a dust. I don't even know for sure what it's made out of. But the developer is coating each one of those individual little particles. And as you dust it across the surface and those particles slide across the surface, if they encounter that dye, a little bit of that developer chemical is going to stick from the moisture of the dye. And it's going to stick in that area and start to blot the dye back out of the crack to make it visible. But it's not going to leave any kind of a background. It's fairly easy to handle and store, other than the fact that it is very light and easily gets airborne. You don't want to breathe it because the particles are small enough it can cause some lung irritation. It's almost like a talc type powder. And it's probably one of the most inexpensive of any of the different developers. So that's Form A, is dry powder. Form B is water soluble. So it can be used with all penetrants except method A. What was a method A penetrant? We just looked at them. What's method A? Pop quiz. Remember there was A, B, C, and D. What was method A? We're going back through slide. Okay. It's a water washable. So if you have a water washable and you try to put a water soluble developer on it, it's going to wash the dye away, right? So you can't use this with a water soluble. So these water soluble ones are typically used with method B and D, with the post emulsifiable type ones, because once the emulsifier is cleaned off, removed, the water no longer has as much of an effect. The nice part is, though, it doesn't require drying of the part. So you're going to do our water washable method A dye, and after you remove the excess penetrant, you have to put it in an oven for a period of time. This eliminates that step. However, well, it eliminates the step, and what the big advantage to that is, if you over dry a part, you can actually kind of bake the dye into the cracks where it won't get blotted back out again. That's why you got to be careful not to put it in the oven too long, or not to have the oven too hot. Again, that oven is just to dry the surface, the water that's on the surface. Powder, in this case, it comes in powder form when you buy it. You mix it with water. Once you mix it with water, it dissolves, and so it doesn't have to be, no further agitation is required. This is like if you take a glass of water, mix some salt in with it. Not a ton of salt, but some salt in it, get it mixed up. That salt is not going to settle to the bottom. It's going to dissolve in there. So you don't have to worry about it settling. Water-based developers like this, water soluble in this case, can pose bacterial and corrosion problems, because you basically have a tub of water sitting there. If it sits around too long, you can start to get bacteria growing in it. From a corrosion standpoint, any kind of metal that you put into water has the potential to cause corrosion. Some metals are more reactive than others. The next one, developer form C, is water suspendable. So this is very similar. It's another water-based developer, but in this case, the developer particles are not water soluble. They're not going to dissolve in the water. They're just going to be in the water, and they're going to be kind of floating in there. Or if they're let just to sit, they're going to sink. They're going to sink to the bottom. So it's a suspension. It's kind of like our mag particle bunch, where we have to mix it up, let it mix up before we use it. Same thing here. So it can be used, in this case, with all penetrants, because you're putting it in and removing it. It's not going to, it doesn't have the same washing action that the water soluble ones do, because you're not leaving the water on for a long period of time. It has a very, very rapid developing action. That's one of the advantages too. So it can be used with those highly sensitive, methods B and D, the post emulsifiable penetrants, and it can be done very quickly. And so if you have an environment where you have to process a lot of parts fast, it doesn't require that you dry the part prior to putting it in, and it does its development action very quickly after the part has been placed in the developer. And so you can move through a lot of parts fairly quickly. But you have to make sure that you keep it agitated. Otherwise, those particles will settle to the bottom. And if the particles settle to the bottom, then all you're doing is dunking your part in water, and it's not gonna, you're not gonna get any developer on it. Essentially, you just bring the part through the suspension bath, and as you put it through, those particles are gonna kind of stick to the surface of the part. You pull it out, and it should have developer. It'll stick to the oil it'll stick to the oil where there is penetrant and cracks, corrosion, or other things like that. Has those same bacteria and corrosion issues that water soluble does. And over time, you got to monitor concentration, how many particles per volume of suspension. And over time, evaporation can cause that to change. Also, you get draw out, whereas you bring parts through it, particles stick to the parts, the level of particles in the suspension is going to drop. Or if your tub is just sitting there over a period of time, the water is going to evaporate. That causes the particle concentration to go up. And so you have to make sure that's correct before you use it. So it adds kind of another step of having to ensure things are working properly. I've got the next two developer forms kind of grouped together, and these are forms D and E. And so this is another one you're going to do in lab. So you're going to use form A, dry powder, in the lab, and you're going to use forms D and E developers in the lab. We're not going to use B or C in our lab. We don't have water soluble or water suspendable. But with developer forms D and E, these are non-aqueous solvent based. Okay? For the most part, it's going to be dispensed out of an aerosol can. So it's some kind of a solvent that they have dissolved the developer in. And when you apply that, the developer, whatever the developer chemical is going to end up on the surface. That solvent is going to evaporate fairly quickly, and it's going to leave the developer behind on the surface of whatever it is that we're testing. So it can be used for all types of methods, and these used to all be called Form D. And back in the originally, if you had non-aqueous solvent, they called it Form D. And then there was some decision made somewhere in the the bodies that govern NDT that they wanted to split this. So Form D is a non-aqueous solvent when it's used, or that is for a type 1 penetrant. Form E is a non-aqueous solvent-based developer that is used with, or that is for a method E penetrant. Sorry, a type 2 penetrant. Sorry, Form E for type 2 penetrant. Okay. In our lab, we have the non-aqueous developer that we use is a dual form developer. It can be used with, we have one developer that you use with both the type 1 and the type 2 penetrants. Okay. So ours is a dual form, D and E. However, you refer to it by the form with whatever type of penetrant you're using it with. So when you conduct your lab and you use our developer with the type 1 penetrants, again, what are type 1 penetrants? What's type 1? Fluorescent. Okay, so if you're using Form D with a fluorescent, or if you're using our developer with the fluorescent penetrant, you refer to it as a Form D. If you are using our non-aqueous solvent-based developer with a type 2 visible dye penetrant, you refer to it as Form E. This is the most sensitive of any of the developers that we use. And so because of that, it's actually replaced a lot of the others in industry because it's fairly quick and it's very, very sensitive. So it has, generally speaking, replaced forms A, B, and C if you're trying to get high sensitivity and do it fairly quickly. What's the trade-off? What do you think why don't we just use it? Why haven't we gone to it and only it? Why do they still use dry powder? Why do they still use water suspendable? And why do they still use water soluble? What advantages would they have? They're cheaper. This is the most expensive of the different, of the forms we've talked about so far. Okay. So it's the most sensitive. It's also the easiest to perform improperly. The biggest way people perform it improperly is they over apply it. And if you over apply it, one is because it has a solvent in it, it can have the effect of dissolving the dye. If too much of that solvent gets applied, it can dissolve the dye before it evaporates. And that's one issue with it if it's too heavily. The other issue if it's too heavy, I don't have it written here, but over application, if you get it too thick, it'll be so thick that it will not blot that dye all the way to the surface. You can get a thick enough coating that the dye will never make its way to the surface. If the dye doesn't make its way to the surface, what does that mean? You're not going to be able to see it. It's going to be below the surface. Okay, so over application can cause mist indications. It can dissolve the dye. You can also get like splotches, or you can get some different false indications if it's not a nice smooth coat. It's kind of like if you spray paint improperly, you get runs, or you get not fisheye really, but runs, or you get where you get kind of the circles if you spray it too heavy in one area. So it's applied by spraying the part. It's almost always portable in aerosol form. They do make some versions of it that can be sprayed in like a paint gun type apparatus. But for the most part, it's done in cans, aerosol form, which makes it portable and easy to use. The last form is kind of a catch-all. So it's not a one specific developer. It's developers that have been created for special applications. And often these are plastic or lacquer based, and what that allows is they're almost like a spray paint developer, where before it dries fully, it blots that dye back out, and then it dries like a paint and leaves a permanent indication. So it can be used where a permanent record of the inspection is required on that point. Now, it's non-removable in the fact that you don't necessarily clean it off when you're done, because it's typically used when you want to have a record that you can see the next time you come up to the bridge, or the next time you come up to whatever it's used on. These aren't used a lot in aerospace. They can ultimately, because it's almost like a paint, they can be removed like a paint. So they're permanent in the sense that paint is permanent. But just like a paint, you can remove it with like a paint stripper, that kind of thing, and then you could perform it again to see if those cracks have grown or changed, if you've had any kind of growth or additional damage that's happened. So things to specify, just to remember, 4 items that we're going to include in our LPI report, whether you are using a type 1 or type 2 penetrant. Again, what's type 1? There we go. I'm getting a few more responses. And type 2? Visible dye. Okay. The sensitivity level of the penetrant. What's the sensitivity level of the penetrants we are using? We have here. I'm seeing some people saying 1, some saying 2. You're both technically correct. Which penetrants that we use are level 1? The visible dye. Our type 2 penetrant is a level 1. Which penetrant that we're using is a level 2? Our type 1, fluorescent. Both the liquid type 1 and the aerosol type 1. How about method of wash? What are the 4 methods of wash? What is A? A is water wash. That's what we have on our test bench. I'm going to skip over. What's C? That's our solvent removal. That's what's in spray cans. How about method B? The entire name. Post-emulsifiable. But that's B and D. What's the rest of it? Dish soap. Dish soap's probably similar to a B. It's probably more similar to a B than a D. Anyone know the whole name for B? B is post-emulsifiable lipophilic. So what is D then? Post-emulsifiable back there, and I heard hydrophilic up here. Post-emulsifiable hydrophilic. So it's more closely bonding to water, whereas B, being lipophilic, is more closely bonding to oil. Okay. So general processing steps. I did a demo, so this is going to go pretty quick. Things to remember: you're going to want to pre-clean your part. It has to be clean. You can't really do this on a painted part, so if you have to remove paint, you may have to do that. If you use paint remover or paint stripper or any kind of solvent, what is very important about the pre-cleaning step? It's dry and you remove all that. Why? What happens if you leave that solvent or whatever on there after pre-cleaning? It's going to dissolve. It's going to have a reaction with the penetrant. Okay? So you got to make sure not only is it pre-cleaned, but you don't have any residual cleaning elements on there, cleaning material on there. Either allow a solvent base to fully evaporate and dry, or if you have a water base, make sure you've rinsed that water-based cleaner off enough that it's all there. Okay, then we apply our penetrant, allow it to dwell. How long do we allow it to dwell for? Typically 10 to 20 minutes. Okay, and then we remove the penetrant. I've got rinse here. That's one way. If you're using, you rinse it if you're using what method of penetrant? Method A, water washable. What if you're using a method C? What do you use to remove the excess penetrant? No, the isopropyl alcohol is for pre and post cleaning only. It's actually too strong. That's a stronger solvent. So when you're performing this, you use the certified cleaner is the only thing you use during that removal stage, besides dry rag. You're actually going to remove most of it with a dry rag and then use the solvent cleaner on a rag to remove the extra. So, and then applying the developer, allow it to dwell or allow it to develop. And then finally we do our inspection. And I've got one more step that I don't have on here, but is probably fairly important. If you're going to put the part back in service, what would that be? You want to do a post clean as well. Okay. So we kind of talked through these different. So pre-cleaning, water, detergent, chemicals, vapor, steam, just make sure the cleaning agents are all off. Things like gasket material, you've all disassembled engines, had gasket material left behind, you got to get rid of that. But you got to be careful. You don't want to use any mechanical methods. So things like bead blast, wire wheel, scraping, sanding. Why can't we use mechanical methods? What is the risk there? The risk is you're going to peen, you could peen those tiny cracks closed where the dye couldn't actually get down inside of them. So, there's limits. Mechanical cleaning can actually hide flaws. Applying can be dipped, sprayed, brushed, okay? Make sure it's complete coverage. If you do too much, it's probably not going to hurt anything. What's the downside of applying too much penetrant? It makes cleaning that much harder. So dwell 10 to 20 minutes is what I say in lab. 10 to 30 minutes is typical. Nothing we're doing here needs a 30-minute dwell. Most of ours, 10 minutes is sufficient. The big key, though, is do not allow the penetrant to dry. We don't want it to dry to the point that we can't blot it back out. So you got to know your penetrant, what the limits are on it. Remove it. So I talked about the method A. Is there water washable? Water pressure, 20 to 40 psi max, using what's called a coarse flow. You don't want a You don't want like a fine jet. You want it kind of dribbling out or just a very light stream. 50 to 100 degrees. And then after you're done, you're going to dry the part. And how long do we dry it for? Till it's dry. You just want it dry so that, especially if you're using a dry powder developer, it doesn't cake all over it. Okay, dry on the surface. You don't want to dry out that penetrant and have it bake into the cracks. Solvent removable. So the solvent in the solvent in the cleaner is fairly aggressive. So if you apply it directly to a part after you've applied your dye, it will dissolve the dye out of those cracks. It'll get pulled down into the cracks as well. So dry wipe to remove most penetrant, and then you're going to damp a cloth with the remover solvent and use that to do kind of some final wipes. Again, don't be sitting there blotting it. You don't want to leave it sitting in one spot. You want to keep it moving so that it doesn't blot the dye back out of the cracks. Method B and D, just a quick summary of that since we don't do it. Emulsify, I talked about it allows water to pull oil or two liquids that don't want to mix or don't naturally mix. So it's a form of chemical and mechanical action. So it was originally designed to reduce the possibility of overwash, but you have to monitor that emulsifying process. Like I said, a matter of 15 seconds can be the difference between a good and a bad inspection when you're using method B, and about a minute for method D. So you got to have part manufacturer specs that have been put together by a non-destructive test engineer to know exactly what to do. And ultimately, you're going to wash with water. You use water wash to remove that penetrant. But method B is the older one, developed in the 1950s. Greater affinity for oil than water. It diffuses into the penetrant, so it actually starts to kind of have almost a dissolving action going on. But it can diffuse down into those cracks and flaws very easily. That's why the more time it's on the part, the higher the risk of getting a overwash scenario takes place. Method D, it has better detection because that's less likely to occur. Method D being hydrophilic, was developed later 1970s, still before I was born even. So it's been around a while, 50 years. So greater affinity for water, better sensitivity, less sensitive to contact and removal time. So basically everything here is better than B. So that's why it's pretty much replaced B. As if you're using a post-emulsifiable method, it's probably going to be method D in today's day and age. Aerosol penetrants, we've gone through that. We did a demo on that, but make sure you apply it completely, especially the areas of interest. When you have a procedure for a given part, it's going to tell you most of the time, these are where you want to look. You know, if you're doing a gear, where is it going to be? Teeth, keyways. You know, think of the high stress areas. What about like a crankshaft? If you were doing, you can do this on a crankshaft. Where would you find it on the crankshaft? The prop flange. Where else are they under high stress? The what? Thrust flange will have high stress. Where else? The journals, particularly which journals? The connecting rod journals are going to have the most going into them. Okay. So that'll be spelled out by the procedure from the manufacturer that was developed by engineers. Okay. If you want to develop these procedures, you would have to go and become what's called a level 3. There's different levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, practitioner of a method of NDT, and level 3 certification allows you're the ones developing these, and it often has not just the NDT training, but there's a certain amount of like engineering training that goes along with it. You don't have to be an engineer. There are plenty of AMPs who go on to get a level 3, but you will be dealing with things like metallurgy and that kind of thing, material science and that kind of thing to understand how you need to test it. Applying the developer dry powder leaves a little bit of a film and sticks to those areas. We just kind of dust it on. Water soluble, water suspendable, dip or spray. Non-aqueous solvent, you spray it on, or applied using an atomizing sprayer like a paint sprayer. And finally, we inspect it using DVI. So detailed visual inspection, our normal tools we use, magnifying glass, flashlight, mirrors. In some cases we can do borescopes. They even make blacklight borescopes for type 1, where the borescope has a blacklight at the tip if you have to look inside of parts being dye penned with type 1. Make sure you have sufficient light for type 2. We talked about black lights when we did other things. So if you're doing type 1, you have to have a black light. It meets the same requirements as the black light used in magnetic particle inspection, fluorescent mag particle. And then finally, to verify your process, and you'll do this in lab, you're going to use a TAM panel. And here you make sure this surface is rough, the bottom half is smooth. You want to have a certain amount of dye on the rough surface. That verifies you didn't overwash it. You don't want a ton of dye stuck to the smooth, shiny surface. Otherwise, that tells you underwashed it. And then there are pit marks in it. And there's a fifth one here that's not shown. So this is a half, a level 1, a level 2, a level 3. And down here would be a level 4 simulated flaw, which allows you to show that I am performing the dye penetrant inspection, and I can find cracks at the level that I say I'm gonna find. And with ours, we're doing level 2. Some people may even be able to see the level 3, but you won't be able to see it consistently. So we can't say you can inspect to a level 3.